So I'm going to do a little lecture series that summarizes my research on the systemic intersection of urban poverty and class within the United States. So just to ground us a little bit of history of how urban poverty came to be and what role class plays in that, is to start with like the emergence of the U.S. cities. They began to change and develop at such a rapid pace following industrialization, and this meant that social relationships also changed, and there became an increased emphasis on class as the main form of social stratification. So as more people moved inward towards the city for economic opportunities, the modern day city then became a profit-making machine and essentially a means for production by the upper class. So the economic landscape that came out of this widened the gap between wealthy elites and lower class because the competition of the scarcity of resources, and that laid foundation for like the inequalities that we see in cities today through like an uneven distribution of resources that create the circumstances for poverty. So today, the number of metro neighborhoods in which 30% or more residents live in poverty has doubled between 1980 and 2010. So this is an issue that is still on the rise. And so now we arrive at the purpose of my research, and basically that is to answer two questions. How does social stratification based on class create poverty within urban areas? And how do social inequalities regarding income and housing based on this stratification manifest in the urban areas? So income inequality and housing inequality are the two areas of focus within my research, and the role that social stratification plays in the development of poverty. And so the theorist who was significant in my research was Karl Marx, because he actually theorized around inequality in society and how social stratification contributed to that through his conflict theories. And then he also theorized around, the role and purpose of the modern day city as an urban political economy. So those are a little bit about that. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, cities became more organized around minimal intervention of the government, and the implementation of social services was primarily determined by local policymakers. So this enabled people with big money and power, like urban planners, financiers, investors, real estate agents, along with other influential figures within cities, to basically rule the city in a way that protected individualistic desires and economic growth over the well-being of the people. And so that is what we see today in a lot of cities. So what that means is that there's a desire for elites to maintain a large labor force by the amount of people that live within the inner city, as people were moving to the city and migrating to the city, and even still today for more job opportunity. But as more people continue to come into cities, that means there's greater competition over the scarcity of available resources and social service. So the high levels of poverty within urban areas today can be attributed to the failures of the early city development in addressing inequality in the distribution of resources, and how that lacks today. So to talk about the two main contributing factors of, how class plays into urban poverty today, the first is going to be employment, because unemployment and employment and employment inequality and income inequality, and how that all links together, because unemployment is just a small factor of income inequality as a whole, but it is one of the largest indicators of poverty within urban areas. So without access to jobs and employment, you can't provide food, clothing, or shelter for yourself, and these are the basic necessities, and this is the definition I'm using to define poverty, when you don't have enough financial freedom to be able to provide the basic needs from yourself. And the harms of unemployment basically exacerbate all the other factors of poverty, such as mental health, physical health, and whatnot. So those who are without employment have higher psychological stress because of that. And households whose usual breadwinners are out of work are 3 times more likely to be poor than working households. But as I said earlier, it's not just about being, employed, because there's still wage gaps, right? There's still a lack of access to sustainable jobs where you don't just make the minimum wage. And so it is important to recognize that unemployment is a large indicator of poverty, as a part of a larger issue of income inequality, which is based on social stratification regarding class. So that's where our class comes into place. Just in fact, 25% of workers still earn wages below the poverty line. So to have a job is not enough, within lower income communities. And COVID really exacerbated this and made it worse because jobs in low paying service industries were down twice as much between February and December 2020 as jobs in medium wage industries, and 4 times as much as high wage industries. So even when there are jobs, low wage jobs are what are impacted most and first when society isn't maybe doing well economically. So the second factor that I look at is housing inequality, because housing inequality and employment inequality are almost like inextricably connected, because you can't afford to live if you don't have a job. You know what I mean? And even having a job, you still might not be able to afford to live, because the affordability of people within urban areas is on a constant increase. And oftentimes people within urban areas are forced to move further away from the metro centers that are like the economic hubs for job opportunity, because they can't afford to live there. And higher wage jobs are usually within the areas where there are higher housing markets, thus, constantly sharpening the gap between income inequality and housing inequality. So the communities, that manufacturers often conduct business in often don't have adequate affordable housing access. And actually, nationally, there's a housing shortage and a housing crisis. So there's no state that has an adequate supply of housing for low-income renters. In fact, the U.S. has a shortage of 7 million rental homes available to extreme low-income renters whose households are at or below 30% of their median income. So totally, there are only 36 affordable low-income units available for rent for every 100 extreme low-income renters. So there's a gap. We got 37 to 100. That's not a lot. You know what I mean? So besides that, the lack of being able to, even afford rent. In March of 2022, 1 in 5, so 20% of renter households with annual incomes below $35,000 were behind on rent. And actually, low-income households make up 60% of all households who are behind on rent. So we're the majority of the people who are unable to afford to pay our rent on time, because probably income inequality. So these two just constantly mesh on a day-to-day basis. So like I said, shelter is a basic necessity that poor people in urban areas don't have the financial capacity to always provide. And there have been historical attempts to rectify this issue by subsidized developments to provide better housing options for poor, disadvantaged communities as a form of revitalization. But really what they have done, what we've seen is that in some ways, they contribute to the concentration of poverty in urban areas and have also contributed to residential segregation. So a good example is the low-income housing tax credit, which is the longest running national affordable housing program within the country. But even that has limitations. For example, number one, housing units are only required to be low income and affordable for 30 years. After that, it's there's no one managing these properties. And even as an extension of that, another issue is that programs like the LIHTC have a question of morality, and are you guys really trying to serve low income communities, or are you guys doing it for a profit? Because a lot of these companies, they specifically receive tax credits that maximize their equity every time they develop in a high poverty area. So it's that is an incentive to keep developing and in high poverty areas, thus adding to the concentration of poverty just in one area. Because if that's where all the affordable housing units are, that's where people are gonna, move towards, because this program creates incentivization, essentially, for constructing in low-income communities. And so this connects, just to bring it full circle one more time, the theoretical framework of Marx and conflict theorists who believe that social stratification is dysfunctional and creates inequality within society that only those that are rich and wealthy benefit from, while the poor are experiencing exploitation of it. And that's where this labor force and the early city development really comes into play. And even Marx himself believed in two class, the ruling class and the working class, and believed that, social stratification created structural barriers rooted in competition that result in the scarcity of resources. So as these structural barriers that I mentioned, like housing and shelter inequality, housing, shelter, and income inequality, are because of social stratification. That's how Marx would seek to answer why these institutions exist, and how the categorization of society based on upper and lower classes contributes to the urban poverty that we see in cities today, Marx will also emphasize the role of influential factors like politicians in the exploitation and economic gain, who benefit from this stratification. So that's pretty much what my paper was. The U.S. poverty rate is higher than the poverty rates of a lot of other comparable wealthy European countries, and that's because we aren't doing much to rectify the issue because it is profitable. Capitalism, the way that capitalism is ingrained in our society, if there is no class division, then it won't be as successful. So in the U.S., you really need stronger local government, city government, since they are in charge of a lot of this local policy and social services within these urban areas. We need it's not enough for the cities to do it alone. We need input from the U.S. government. We need more programs to rectify this issue that address housing crisis that isn't just about incentivization. And as COVID hits, these issues are continually getting worse. Poor people are even poorer now than they were pre-pandemic, and the unemployment rate in April 2020 actually went to a level that was not seen since the 1930s. And that's not even including job losses. So this issue of urban poverty is inextricably connected to class and social stratification, and the failure of early city development, and today the failure of current city government development and city development as a whole in regards to social services and things that are outside of seeking economic gain. So, yeah.